Princess Xelara sat in silence, her hands clenched into fists on her lap, though her heart pounded wildly inside her chest. The cold, metallic walls of the transport vessel felt like the walls of a prison, trapping her in a fate she could not escape. Outside the reinforced viewport, the human battleship loomed ahead, an enormous beast of war, its dark hull reflecting the dim light of the distant stars. It looked nothing like the elegant, silver-spired vessels of her people. No, this was a war machine, built not for beauty but for destruction. And soon, she would be at the mercy of the monster who commanded it. Captain Darius Kane. She had heard the stories. A ruthless human warlord who had single-handedly turned the tide of the war against her people. A man so feared that even the fiercest Zorvian warriors whispered his name with caution. His reputation preceded him, merciless in battle, unforgiving in strategy. And now, thanks to the treaty forced upon them, her husband. Xelara shuddered. The marriage was nothing more than a political move, a way to keep the fragile peace between the Zorvian Empire and the rising power of humanity. Her father, Emperor Vorlax, had agreed to it grudgingly, unwilling to admit that the war had drained their forces more than anticipated. And as the Emperor's only daughter, she had been the perfect bargaining chip. She was to be given away like a prize to the one who had bested their forces, a symbol of submission hidden beneath the pretense of diplomacy. The ship jolted as it docked inside the battleship's massive hangar bay. Xelara stiffened, her breath catching as the doors slid open with a hiss. Armed human soldiers stood waiting outside, their faces expressionless behind their helmets. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood like silent sentinels of an alien world. Her guards flanked her as she stepped forward, though she knew they were powerless here. They were merely for show, an illusion of control when she had none. Her silk robes, woven with shimmering gold and deep violet, a mark of her royal lineage, felt heavy on her shoulders, the weight of an unwanted destiny pressing down on her. Then she saw him. Darius Kane stood at the center of the hangar, hands folded behind his back, his dark uniform crisp and unyielding. His frame was tall, powerful, built like the warriors of old. His face was rugged, his jaw sharp, his deep-set eyes an unreadable storm of blue. He was not adorned in extravagant robes or draped in jewels like the men of her world. No, he was steel and flesh, a weapon forged through war and fire. Xelara swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She expected cruelty, coldness, perhaps even satisfaction in seeing her brought here like a conquered trophy. But there was none of that in his expression. His face remained unreadable, yet there was no malice, no gloating, no sense of victory. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She did not bow, did not speak first. She would not give him that satisfaction, no matter how much fear churned inside her. Darius took a step forward, his boots echoing against the polished floor. He studied her for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice calm, steady. "You don't have to look at me like I'm about to devour you." Xelara flinched. She hadn't realized how tense she was until now. Her fingers twitched at her sides, but she kept her posture rigid. "I am to be your wife," she said, her voice cool despite the turmoil within. "You are my captor. How else should I look at you?" Darius exhaled through his nose, a hint of something flashing across his face, something she couldn't quite place. It was gone before she could analyze it. "I don't take prisoners," he replied. "And I don't need a wife who sees me as her jailer." Xelara clenched her jaw. What game was he playing? She had been prepared for many things. Anger, mockery, even force. But this calm, measured man before her, it was unnerving. The moment stretched between them, heavy with words unsaid. Then, without another glance, Darius turned sharply on his heel. "Come," he said simply. "Your quarters have been prepared." And with that, he walked away, leaving her standing there, confused and off balance. Xelara did not move immediately. Her mind raced. Where was the cruelty? the gloating. Why was he acting as if this arrangement was just as much a burden to him as it was to her? For the first time since she was told of this marriage, Xelara felt something far worse than fear. She felt uncertainty. Xelara followed in silence, her footsteps light against the cold metal floor. The vast corridors of the human worship stretched before her, illuminated by soft, artificial lighting that cast a sterile glow against the steel walls. It was nothing like the grand halls of the Zorgian palace, where the ceilings stretched high and the walls pulsed with living crystal. Here, everything was rigid, controlled, built for efficiency rather than beauty. Her Zorvian guards had been dismissed the moment she stepped off the landing ramp. They had protested, but Darius had not even looked at them as he ordered his men to escort them to their designated quarters elsewhere on the ship. She had been left with no choice but to follow him alone. There was no spoken threat, no show of force, but the authority in his voice had been absolute. She studied his back as he led her through the corridors. His movements were precise, his posture unwavering. He did not stride ahead like a man who saw himself above others, nor did he slow his pace to accommodate her. He simply expected her to follow, and without any real alternative, she did. At first, she had been wary, every step tense, her mind racing with possibilities. She had expected to be led into a holding cell, a chamber fit for a hostage rather than a bride. Instead, when the doors finally slid open, she found herself standing inside a chamber far more luxurious than she had anticipated. The walls were smooth, the furniture modern but comfortable. There was no gilded excess, no unnecessary decoration, but neither was it harsh or unwelcoming. A large viewing panel stretched across one side, revealing the vast emptiness of space beyond. A bed, larger than she expected, was positioned against one wall, neatly arranged with soft linens. There was a desk, a sitting area, and a separate chamber that she assumed led to the cleansing facilities. For a warship, it was almost pleasant. She turned, half expecting Darius to be watching her with some smug expression, waiting for her reaction. But he had already stepped away from the entrance, walking toward a control panel on the far side of the room. With a few quiet taps, the lighting dimmed to a softer glow. "You have full access to this room," he said, his voice calm, businesslike. "The doors will lock from the inside. No one enters unless you allow it." She narrowed her eyes, her confusion growing. "You are giving me privacy." Darius turned to face her, his arms loosely crossed over his chest. "I'm giving you space," he corrected. "You're not my prisoner, Xelara." His words made her stiffen, her heart twisting with mistrust. "I find that difficult to believe." Darius sighed, as if he had been expecting her reaction. "Believe what you want," he said, "but the reality is, you're here, and unless you want this entire treaty to fall apart, we have to coexist." She swallowed, her throat dry. She knew the weight of this arrangement, knew that the fragile peace between their species depended on it, but knowing that did not make it easier to accept. She took a slow step forward, her fingers grazing the smooth edge of the desk. "What do you expect from me?" she asked. Darius studied her for a moment before answering. "I expect you to take your time," he said. "Get used to being here. You won't be expected to do anything you're not ready for." She blinked, caught off guard. That was not the answer she had expected. The Zorvian way was different. Marriage, especially a political one, was an immediate contract. There was no period of adjustment, no waiting. It was a binding agreement, sealed the moment the vows were spoken. And yet here he was, telling her she had time. It made no sense. She lifted her chin, trying to keep her voice steady. "And if I refuse to play the part of your bride?" Darius didn't hesitate. "Then we'll figure out something else." She inhaled sharply, frustration and uncertainty warring inside her. "You speak as if you don't even want this marriage." For the first time, something in his expression shifted. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, but it was gone before she could name it. "I never asked for it," he admitted, but that doesn't mean I intend to make it any harder than it needs to be." His honesty unsettled her more than threats ever could. Xelara turned away, facing the large viewing panel that overlooked the stars. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring into the void beyond. Somewhere out there, her homeworld was drifting through space, her people continuing their lives as if she had already been forgotten. Was her father relieved to be rid of her, or did he still see her as a useful tool, a piece to be played on the political board? A lump formed in her throat, but she pushed it down. She would not let herself feel weak, not in front of this human warlord who claimed to be nothing like the stories. Behind her, she heard Darius shift, his boots quiet against the floor. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said. "If you need anything, you can call for one of my crew. I won't be far." She did not turn around. She did not answer. She expected him to demand a response, to insist that she acknowledge him. But instead, she heard his footsteps retreating, the soft hiss of the doors sliding open, then shutting behind him. She was alone, her hands curled into fists. Why was he like this? Why was he not the monster she had been told he was? Xelara exhaled shakily, lowering herself onto the edge of the bed. The weight of everything pressed down on her, but she could not afford to break. Not yet. Not until she understood what kind of man Darius Kane truly was. Xelara spent the next few days in a state of restless unease. She had expected hostility, control, or even cold indifference from Darius Kane. Instead, he remained distant yet oddly respectful, giving her space, as though he truly meant what he had said. She was not locked away, not treated as a captive or a trophy to be paraded in front of his people. He made no attempts to force conversation, no demands of obedience, no threats. That was what unsettled her the most. She knew how to resist cruelty. She had prepared for it. But this quiet patience was something she did not know how to fight against. Her quarters, though unfamiliar, were comfortable, and she had been given full access to move about certain parts of the ship under escort. The human crew members she passed did not look at her with contempt or mockery. Some seemed curious, others wary, but no one spoke to her unless necessary. It was as if she were a ghost, drifting between two worlds, belonging to neither. And then, one night, curiosity got the better of her. The corridors were dimly lit during the ship's artificial night cycle, casting long shadows along the steel walls. The air was cool, sterile, humming with the ever-present sound of the ship's engines deep beneath the surface. Xelara moved carefully, listening, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't supposed to wander alone, but she had found that the security systems were not designed to keep her locked in. A silent invitation, perhaps, to learn more, if she dared. She turned a corner, her breath catching when she saw a light still glowing from a partially open door. Voices drifted toward her, quiet but firm. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. "We intercepted a transmission from the Zorhian fleet. No mention of aggression, but their movement patterns suggest they're preparing for something." Darius's voice followed, calm but edged with tension. "They're testing us, seeing if we react. They know breaking the treaty would cost them, but that doesn't mean they won't try to shift the balance." Xelara's pulse quickened. What were her people planning? She had assumed the marriage was meant to seal peace, but if there was still tension, still suspicion, then had she been wrong to believe the war was truly over? Another voice spoke, lower and more hesitant. "And the princess?" A pause. Then Darius answered, "She knows nothing of this, and she will not be used as a tool for either side." Xelara exhaled slowly, stepping away from the wall before she was caught eavesdropping. She turned down another corridor, intending to return to her quarters, but movement ahead made her stop. A small figure darted into the shadows. Frowning, she stepped forward cautiously. The ship's security measures would have stopped any unknown intruders, which meant a child. Xelara blinked in surprise as the figure turned, revealing wide, frightened eyes. The child was not human. His skin was pale blue, his large, dark eyes luminous in the dim light. A Norithian, if she was not mistaken, a species known for their delicate frames and heightened intelligence. But what was a child of his kind doing on a human warship? The boy took a hesitant step backward, as if preparing to flee. Xelara knelt slightly, keeping her voice soft. "I won't hurt you." The child hesitated, clearly weighing his options. He was young, no more than 7 or 8 in human years, but his clothes were simple and worn, not the uniform of a crew member. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The boy swallowed. Terran. An Orithian name. He belonged to no royal family she recognized, no noble house. So why was he here? Before she could ask, a new voice interrupted. "He's under my protection." Xelara turned sharply to see Darius standing a few steps away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had not raised his voice, had not even taken an aggressive stance, yet she still felt caught, as if she had stumbled upon something she was not meant to see. She glanced back at the child, who quickly ran to Darius's side. "You're looking after him?" she asked. Darius gave a short nod. His colony was wiped out in the war. He had no one left. Xelara inhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. A human warlord, a feared commander, protecting an orphaned alien child. This was not what she had been taught about humans, not what she had believed about the man she had been forced to marry. Darius met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. "This is why I fight. Not for conquest, not for power, but to make sure the innocent don't suffer for the choices of those who lead them." Xelara felt something shift within her, a crack in the foundation of the fear and resentment she had built around him. He was not the monster she had expected, and now she was beginning to wonder if she had been wrong about much more than just him. Xelara couldn't sleep that night. The quiet hum of the ship's systems filled the air, but her mind was restless, trapped in a loop of doubt and confusion. Darius Kane was supposed to be a ruthless warlord, a man who had won battle after battle with sheer brutality. She had been prepared to hate him, to resist him at every turn, but the more she saw of him, the more the stories unraveled. She had expected cruelty. Instead, she saw patience. She had expected arrogance. Instead, she saw duty. And now, after seeing him with the child, Terran, she had seen something she never thought possible. Compassion. The idea that a human warlord, a conqueror of worlds, would take in an orphaned alien child, not for political gain, but simply because he could not turn away, shook her to her core. It did not fit into the image of humans that had been drilled into her since birth. And if that image was false, what else had been lies? She turned over in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts in turmoil. Then a sound caught her attention. Faint, almost imperceptible, but not a natural hum of the ship. It was sharp, mechanical. Something was wrong. Xelara pushed aside the sheets and rose quietly. The feeling in her gut told her this was not just her imagination. Moving toward the door, she hesitated only for a moment before pressing the control panel. The doors slid open soundlessly, and she stepped into the corridor. The halls were dimly lit in the artificial night cycle, shadows stretching along the walls. At first, everything seemed normal, but then she heard it again. Movement, quick but calculated, as if someone was trying not to be heard. She followed the sound, her heartbeat quickening, her Zorvian instincts sharpened, her senses attuned to danger. She turned a corner and saw a figure dressed in dark, tactical gear, moving toward one of the control stations along the wall. He was not human. His tall, lean frame and segmented exoskeletal armor told her he was Zorvian, one of her own, but he did not belong here. Xelara inhaled sharply, stepping forward. "What are you doing?" The figure spun around, his black visor reflecting the dim light. He did not hesitate. In an instant, he raised his weapon, one designed to be silent, deadly, and precise. Xelara barely had time to move. A shot fired, missing her by mere inches as she lunged behind a support beam. Her mind raced. This was not a crew member. This was an assassin, and he had no interest in taking her alive. The second shot rang out, striking the metal where she had been standing moments before. Before she could react, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from another corridor. The assassin turned, ready to fire, but then a figure slammed into him at full force, knocking the weapon from his hands. Darius. He moved with brutal efficiency, a trained warrior who had seen countless battles. The assassin struck back, but Darius blocked the attack with a swift counter, twisting the enemy's arm with a sickening crack. The Zorvian let out a strangled sound before Darius threw him to the ground, pinning him with a knee to his back. Xelara scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in short gasps. Darius did not look at her immediately. His focus was on the struggling assassin beneath him. His voice was low, edged with lethal calm. "Who sent you?" The Zorvian spat, his mandibles clicking in defiance. Darius exhaled through his nose, barely restrained fury in his expression. "Fine. We'll do this the hard way." Two human soldiers arrived seconds later, drawn by the commotion. Darius didn't need to explain. The men immediately restrained the assassin, securing his arms with reinforced cuffs. Only then did Darius turn to Xelara, his sharp eyes scanning her quickly, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her hands trembled slightly. "No." His jaw tightened. "Then we need to talk." Minutes later, Xelara found herself in Darius's private office. It was a stark but functional space, lined with display monitors and tactical readouts. He paced the room, the tension in his posture evident. She watched him, still shaken. "Who was he?" she asked. Darius stopped, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "An assassin from your own empire." The words hit harder than she expected. Xelara clenched her fists. "But why? Why would my own people send someone to kill me?" Darius's expression darkened. "Because your father never intended for this treaty to hold." She shook her head instinctively. "No, that can't be true. The war cost us too much. My father agreed to this marriage because he had no choice." Darius exhaled sharply, his frustration clear, but he kept his voice steady. "That's exactly the point, Xelara. He had no choice, and men like your father don't accept weakness." She wanted to argue, to deny it, but the pieces were falling into place too quickly. If her father had truly wanted peace, why send an assassin? Why try to kill her, unless she was no longer useful to him? Darius watched her closely, his tone gentler now. "They see you as a liability. If you stay here, if you learn the truth about them, you become a threat to their control." Xelara sank into one of the chairs, her mind spinning. She had spent her whole life believing in the honor of her people, the righteousness of their cause. But now it felt as if the ground beneath her had been ripped away. Darius moved toward her, resting his hands on the desk. "You're not just a pawn to them, Xelara. You're an obstacle, one they're willing to remove." She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. But there was none. Only truth, and something else. Something she hadn't noticed before. Concern. Not as a political leader, not as a soldier, but as a man who did not want to see her harmed. She swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" Darius straightened, his expression hardening with resolve. "We prepare, because this was just the first attempt." Xelara's pulse quickened. The war might have ended on paper, but in the shadows it had only just begun. Xelara had spent her entire life believing in the strength and honor of her people. She had trusted in their wisdom, their power, their absolute certainty that the Zorvian Empire was superior in all things. But now, as she sat in the quiet isolation of her chambers aboard the human warship, she was beginning to understand that everything she had known had been built on a lie. Her father had sent an assassin to kill her. Not the humans. Not Darius Kane. Her own people. That fact alone weighed on her more than she could comprehend. If Darius had not intervened, if he had not been there at the exact moment the assassin had struck, she would be dead. Her life would have been ended in an instant, and the empire she had once believed in would have continued as though she had never existed. She clenched her fists in her lap, her mind racing. Why had she been so blind? Why had she refused to see the cracks in the foundation of the empire? The Zorvian leadership had always been ruthless, but she had believed it was a necessity of power, a means of maintaining control in a chaotic universe. Now she saw the truth. Power was the only thing that mattered to them. Even their own blood was expendable if it meant securing their rule. The door to her chambers hissed open. Xelara turned sharply, her breath catching, but it was only Darius. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. He had removed his formal command jacket, leaving only the dark, fitted undershirt that marked him as a soldier. His presence was strong, steady, but she could see the tension in his frame. He had spent the last few hours dealing with the aftermath of the assassination attempt, interrogating the prisoner, and strengthening security aboard the ship. Now he was here for her. "You haven't left your quarters," he said, his voice calm. Not accusing, not demanding. Just an observation. Xelara looked away. What would be the point? "Your ship is safer than my own home ever was." Darius exhaled, stepping closer. "You're processing a lot." She let out a hollow laugh. "That is an understatement." There was a pause. She could feel his eyes on her, steady and unreadable, but he did not push. She had learned, in the time she had spent observing him, that he was not the type of man to demand answers. He allowed space, gave people time to make their own choices. It was strange. It was human. Finally, she met his gaze. "The assassin. Did he say anything?" Darius hesitated for half a second, so brief that most would not have noticed. But she did. She straightened, her pulse quickening. "He did, didn't he?" Darius exhaled slowly, then nodded. "He was ordered to eliminate you if you showed signs of siding with us." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her father had not just sent an assassin as a precaution. He had been watching her, waiting to see if she would turn against the Empire. And the moment he suspected she was no longer loyal, he had ordered her death. Xelara gritted her teeth. "Then I was never meant to survive this marriage." Darius's expression darkened. "No." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Xelara stood, her hands tightening into fists. "I won't go back." Darius didn't react, as if he had already expected her answer. "Then what do you want to do?" The question caught her off guard. He wasn't telling her what needed to happen next. He wasn't making the decision for her. He was giving her a choice. She had never been given a choice before. Her entire life had been dictated by duty, by expectations, by the will of her father. But now, for the first time, she had the power to decide her own path. Xelara lifted her chin. "I want to know everything. About the Empire. About what my father has done. About what happens next." Darius nodded once. "Then I'll show you." The warship's strategy room was vast, its walls lined with holographic displays projecting real-time data on Zorvian fleet movements, intercepted transmissions, and political developments across the galaxy. It was the nerve center of human intelligence, the place where decisions of war and peace were made. Xelara stood in the center of it all, her gaze fixed on the shifting maps before her. She could see the patterns in the data, the way her father was maneuvering the Empire's forces under the guise of maintaining order. But she saw it for what it really was, a slow, calculated build-up for something bigger. Darius stood beside her, arms crossed. "Your father never intended for this treaty to last. The marriage was just a delay tactic. He's been repositioning his fleets, waiting for the right moment to strike." Xelara inhaled sharply. She had suspected as much, but seeing the proof in front of her made it undeniable. The Zorvian Empire was preparing for war, again. She turned to Darius. "Then we have to stop him." Darius arched a brow. "We?" She squared her shoulders. "Yes, I won't be a pawn in his game anymore." Darius studied her for a long moment. "This won't be easy. If you turn against your father, you'll be labeled a traitor. There's no going back from that." Xelara met his gaze without hesitation. Then I will be a traitor. Something flickered in Darius's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or something deeper. He nodded slowly. Then we do this together. Together. Xelara never thought she would find herself on the side of humans, standing beside the very man she had once feared. But the war she had been raised to believe in had never been just. And now, for the first time, she was choosing her own battle. One that she intended to win. Xelara stood at the edge of the warship's strategy room, her gaze fixed on the holographic projections of her father's fleet movements. A week ago, she would have seen them as a sign of strength, a testament to the power of the Zorgian Empire. Now she saw them for what they truly were, preparations for betrayal. Her father had never intended to honor the treaty. The marriage had been a ruse, a way to buy time while the Empire repositioned its fleets. And she had been nothing more than a disposable piece in his grand game of war. The realization burned in her chest, but she did not let it break her. If anything, it only made her more determined. She turned to Darius, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed as he studied the same data. His presence was steady, a quiet force of resolve. He had given her space to process everything, had not pushed her to make decisions before she was ready. But now, time was running out. The Zorgian fleet is gathering at the border, Darius said, his voice calm but firm. We intercepted a transmission. Your father is calling for a war council. He's preparing to strike. Xelara clenched her fists. Then we have to act before he does. Darius studied her for a moment. You know what that means, don't you? She met his gaze without hesitation. Yes. It meant treason. It meant standing against the empire that had raised her, against the father who had shaped her entire life. It meant leaving behind everything she had ever known. But she had already made her choice. Darius nodded, as if he had seen the answer in her eyes before she spoke it. Then we need a plan. The warship's briefing chamber was filled with the highest-ranking officers of Darius's fleet, hardened soldiers, experienced commanders, men and women who had fought against the Zorgian Empire and knew the cost of failure. They stood in a semicircle around the central holographic display, listening intently as Darius and Xelara laid out their strategy. Xelara had expected resistance. She was, after all, the daughter of the very man who had led the war against them. But the skepticism in the room was outweighed by something else: determination. They won't expect an internal strike, Darius said, his voice steady as he pointed to the map. They think Xelara is still under their control. We use that. One of the officers, a woman with sharp eyes and a scar across her cheek, spoke up. You're suggesting we send her back into enemy territory. Xelara did not flinch. It's the only way. Murmurs spread through the room. Darius let them speak, let them voice their concerns. But when the murmurs died down, he turned to her. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Xelara nodded. I know my father's tactics. I know his weaknesses. If I can get close enough, I can dismantle his plans from the inside. Darius's jaw tightened. He did not like this plan. She could see it in the way his fingers curled slightly against the table, in the flicker of hesitation behind his otherwise unreadable expression. But he also knew it was the best option they had. Finally, he exhaled, turning back to the room. We'll do it. The transport ship was small, designed for stealth rather than combat. It had been modified to resemble a Zorvian vessel, its systems adjusted to pass through enemy scanners undetected. Xelara sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring at the star-filled expanse beyond the viewport. She would be home soon. Except it was not home anymore. Darius stood beside her, arms crossed. The rest of the crew was already in position, ready for the mission to begin. But for now, it was just the two of them. This is dangerous, he said quietly. Xelara turned to him, offering a small, almost amused smile. I think I figured that out already. He didn't return the smile. Instead, he reached for his side and pulled out a small, sleek device, handing it to her. "A comlink," he explained. "Encrypted. If something goes wrong, we get you out." Xelara took it, her fingers brushing his as she did. A brief, fleeting contact, but enough to send something unspoken between them. "I won't fail," she said. Darius's gaze softened, just slightly. "You'd better not." For a moment, there was only silence between them. Then, finally, he stepped back, nodding toward the controls. "It's time." Xelara exhaled slowly, turning her attention back to the viewport. This was it. The last chance to stop a war before it began, and she would not let it slip through her fingers.